So can you give everybody an insight into what you're watching for 2025?
So what I'm watching for 2025, I've just been looking at the adoption of AI across the space, right, and all of the industries that we're ultimately serving in insurance. And my trend is, I think carriers are going to have to become much more intentional about AI coverage because the pace of adoption for consumers and businesses has really been unprecedented. And really, even as we look at the past couple of years, it's been fueled by the arrival of generative AI. So when I look at what we're seeing, I see that the AI risk exposure is here, but the insurance coverage is really unclear. And there's also active case law that's been evolving, and that active case law has proved that so far that AI usage has been the root cause of damages. So when we think about the issue, when we think about what the insurers and the carriers need to focus their attention on, it really is because there's no affirmative coverage grant right now in any of the insurance policies, right? It's something that's silent, right? So you have to really pursue that coverage either under the general liability or under the professional liability. So, we have to, as an industry, focus on whether or not there's a viable product that's ultimately going to be brought to market. And I know that there's a handful of carriers that's trying to build out what that potential viable product is going to be. Emma, when I think about this, I really think about it in the context of the early days of cyber, right, where the industry was challenged really to quantify that AI risk. And it's huge. Even if you go back to one of the high-profile incidents that we saw with one of the federal cases where one of the attorneys used ChatGPT in one of their cases, and ultimately it started hallucinating and creating case law that ultimately wound up getting thrown out. So I believe that the only way for us to move forward as an industry is just a handful of things. I go back to what science did with cyber and developing a scoring model that ultimately helped carriers to quantify the cyber risk. I think that's going to have to be the same thing with AI risk. And then finally, I also believe that carriers are going to really have to focus their attention on not having silent AI coverage, but really creating some sort of an affirmative coverage grant, really, in order to address that AI risk, because we've just seen it adopted across the board, right? When you think about law and legal, but also in manufacturing and, even in hospitality in those industries. So it's a huge risk, and the undercurrent that's coming into play, it's really going to create a risk for the insurance industry that could potentially bubble up into something that we just haven't expected.
I think that this is such an important conversation because everybody is so focused over here on how do we use AI that we're not thinking about the other balancing act that comes into it, or not thinking about it enough. And also kind of the intersection between what happens with cyber and AI. You mentioned the idea of cyber, but what happens when the bad guys have AI in their hands as well? And what does that do to cyber risk? And how much do we see all of that starting to play out in a really big way in the next couple of years, I think is a very important thing for us to be talking more about and watching.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's part of the reason why carriers have to be ultimately cognizant of it, right? And there's the carrier part of it, but there's also the business side, right? When we think about the SMBs, because they're adopting this and they're using this within their practices across the board, not even understanding what the potential risks could be and even how it could potentially drive cyber risk. So, it's something that I think we have to, identify, and we have to be cognizant of as an industry. But the reality is that businesses also have to be cognizant of the risk as well.